The year 2022 marked a significant turning point in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. The world watched as tensions escalated and the situation on the ground became increasingly dire. The United States, a staunch ally of Ukraine, made a pivotal decision that would alter the course of the conflict. It approved the transfer of advanced Western weapons to the Ukrainian military, a move that was both strategic and symbolic. This decision, while controversial, was driven by the increasingly dire situation on the ground. Ukrainian forces were struggling to hold their positions against a relentless Russian advance. Russian forces, despite early setbacks, were making slow but steady gains in eastern Ukraine. The conflict was becoming a war of attrition, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Ukrainian government, facing an existential threat, pleaded for more powerful weapons to counter the Russian offensive. They argued that without significant military aid, their chances of repelling the invaders were slim. The U.S. decision to supply Ukraine with Western weapons was not taken lightly. It was the result of intense deliberations and strategic calculations. It came after months of debate within the Biden administration and among NATO allies. The discussions were complex, weighing the potential benefits against the risks. Some argued that providing Ukraine with such advanced weaponry would be viewed as escalatory by Russia, potentially leading to a wider conflict. The fear of provoking a direct confrontation with Russia was a significant concern. Others contended that Ukraine had the right to defend itself with all means necessary, and that providing them with the tools to do so was a moral imperative. They believed that supporting Ukraine was not just a strategic choice, but a moral duty. Ultimately, the Biden administration decided to provide Ukraine with a range of advanced weapon systems, including Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and, most significantly, HIMARS rocket launchers. These systems were chosen for their effectiveness and their ability to change the dynamics on the battlefield. These weapons, particularly the HIMARS, would prove to be a game changer on the battlefield. They provided the Ukrainian forces with a much-needed technological edge. They provided Ukraine with the ability to strike Russian targets with unprecedented precision and range, shifting the balance of power in the conflict. This newfound capability allowed Ukraine to launch more effective counterattacks. The decision to provide Ukraine with Western weapons was a watershed moment in the conflict. It marked a significant escalation in the level of support provided by the West. It signaled a deepening commitment from the U.S. and its allies to supporting Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression. This move was seen as a clear message to Russia that the West would not stand idly by. However, it also raised the stakes of the conflict, increasing the risk of a wider war between Russia and the West. The potential for escalation was a constant shadow over the decision, reminding all parties of the high stakes involved. Among the array of Western weapons supplied to Ukraine, the High-Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, emerged as a game-changer. This advanced system quickly became a symbol of the West's commitment to supporting Ukraine in its struggle against Russian aggression. This mobile rocket artillery system, manufactured by Lockheed Martin, quickly gained notoriety for its precision, range, and devastating firepower. Its ability to be rapidly deployed and repositioned made it a versatile tool on the battlefield. Unlike traditional artillery, HIMARS utilizes satellite guidance, enabling it to hit targets with pinpoint accuracy at distances exceeding 50 miles. This technological edge allowed Ukrainian forces to conduct precise strikes with minimal collateral damage, a crucial factor in a conflict where civilian areas are often perilously close to military targets. This capability proved crucial in countering Russia's initial advantage in long-range artillery. The ability to strike from a distance without exposing their own positions gave Ukrainian forces a strategic edge. The arrival of HIMARS on the battlefield in the summer of 2022 marked a turning point in the conflict. It was a moment that signaled a shift in the balance of power, providing Ukraine with a much-needed boost in its defensive and offensive operations. Ukrainian forces, previously outgunned in artillery duels, now possessed a weapon that could match and even surpass the range and accuracy of Russian systems. This upgrade was not just a tactical improvement but a morale booster for the Ukrainian troops, who had been under relentless pressure. This newfound capability allowed Ukraine to strike critical Russian military infrastructure, including ammunition depots, command posts, and logistical hubs, deep behind enemy lines. These strikes were not random but carefully planned to maximize disruption and weaken the enemy's operational capabilities. The impact of HIMARS was immediate and significant. The precision and power of these strikes forced the Russian military to rethink its strategies and redeploy its assets, often to less advantageous positions. Russian forces, accustomed to operating with relative impunity in rear areas, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to long-range Ukrainian strikes. This newfound vulnerability disrupted their sense of security and operational rhythm. Ammunition depots essential for sustaining their offensive operations were destroyed, disrupting their logistics and forcing them to relocate key assets further from the front lines. This relocation not only slowed down their operations but also stretched their supply lines, making them more susceptible to further attacks. This disruption significantly hampered Russia's ability to sustain its offensive operations, particularly in the south. The logistical challenges created by HIMARS strikes meant that Russian forces had to operate with fewer resources and under constant threat of further attacks. Moreover, the psychological impact of HIMARS on Russian forces was undeniable. The constant threat of precision strikes created a climate of fear and uncertainty among Russian troops. The realization that they were no longer safe from Ukrainian strikes even in rear areas eroded their morale and sowed doubt about their ability to achieve their objectives. This psychological warfare aspect of HIMARS was as potent as its physical destruction. This psychological blow, coupled with the material losses inflicted by HIMARS, contributed to a shift in the momentum of the war, favoring Ukraine. The combination of strategic strikes and the erosion of enemy morale created a scenario where Ukrainian forces could capitalize on their gains and push back against the Russian advance more effectively. The introduction of HIMARS into the Ukraine conflict was more than just a boost in firepower, it was a strategic masterstroke. Ukrainian forces, recognizing the limitations of directly engaging Russia's larger army in head-on confrontations, adopted a strategy of attrition. This involved targeting the Achilles heel of the Russian military machine, its cumbersome and often antiquated logistics. HIMARS, with its range and precision, became the ideal weapon for this strategy. Ukrainian forces began systematically targeting Russian ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, and key bridges used for transporting supplies. By crippling Russia's ability to sustain its forces at the front lines, Ukraine aimed to grind down the Russian offensive, forcing them into a war of attrition they were ill-equipped to win. This strategy proved remarkably effective. Russian advances, which had been steadily gaining ground in the Donbas region, began to slow and eventually stall. The lack of essential supplies, particularly artillery shells, severely hampered Russian offensive operations. Moreover, the constant threat of HIMARS strikes forced Russian commanders to disperse their supplies and troops, making them less effective and easier to target. The success of this strategy highlighted a key vulnerability in the Russian military, its over-reliance on centralized logistics and its inability to adapt to modern warfare. The Ukrainian military, on the other hand, demonstrated a remarkable ability to leverage Western technology and adapt its tactics to exploit enemy weaknesses. While the U.S. provision of HIMARS to Ukraine marked a turning point in the conflict, it came with a crucial caveat: limitations on their use. The Biden administration, wary of escalating the conflict and provoking a direct confrontation with Russia, imposed restrictions on the types of targets Ukraine could strike with these weapons. Specifically, Ukraine was prohibited from using HIMARS to strike targets within Russian territory, even military targets. This restriction stemmed from the administration's fear that striking targets within Russia would be perceived as escalatory by Moscow, potentially leading to a wider war. The U.S. sought to provide Ukraine with the means to defend itself without crossing a red line that could trigger a broader conflict. The range limitations on HIMARS munitions provided to Ukraine further underscored this cautious approach. While the U.S. possesses HIMARS systems capable of firing missiles with ranges of up to 300 kilometers, Ukraine received munitions with a maximum range of around 80 kilometers. This limited Ukraine's ability to strike deep into Russian territory, even if it chose to disregard U.S. restrictions. These limitations, while understandable from a strategic perspective, created frustration among some Ukrainian officials and military commanders. They argued that the inability to strike targets within Russia, particularly military bases and infrastructure supporting the invasion, hampered their ability to effectively defend themselves. They contended that Russia enjoyed a safe haven within its own borders, allowing it to launch attacks with impunity. This safe haven meant that Russian forces could regroup, resupply, and plan further offensives without fear of retaliation on their own soil. Ukrainian officials felt that this imbalance put them at a significant disadvantage, as they were constantly under threat, while their adversaries operated from a position of relative security. The frustration was not just about the immediate tactical limitations, but also about the broader strategic implications. They believed that the ability to target key logistical hubs and command centers within Russia could disrupt the enemy's operations and potentially shorten the conflict. However, the U.S. administration remained firm in its stance, emphasizing the importance of avoiding actions that could escalate the war beyond Ukraine's borders. This cautious approach was rooted in a desire to prevent a larger, more destructive conflict that could draw in other nations and lead to widespread devastation. The balance between providing effective support to Ukraine and managing the risks of escalation was a delicate one, and the limitations on HIMARS usage were a reflection of this complex strategic calculus. Despite the frustrations, the U.S. continued to support Ukraine in other ways, providing intelligence, training, and additional military aid to bolster its defense capabilities. The hope was that even within these constraints, Ukraine could still mount a robust defense and eventually push back the invading forces.